Would Putin have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine were in NATO?
No, not a chance.
Why?
Because Putin fundamentally is scared of NATO. What his invasion of Ukraine did is to show us how weak the Red Army is.
What is the likely outcome?
I think in the end,
Grant Shapps.
He is the former MP
and Secretary of Defence.
What do you think are the biggest issues the UK economy faces today?
lack of productivity, overly taxed, lack of entrepreneurial understanding, and a cabinet stuffed full of absolutely nobody who's been in business at all. And it shows. Biggest challenges are we're going to need a lot more energy, and we see it through data centres, training LLMs. A small hidden British success story is that Britain actually leads Europe when it comes to renewable energy production.
I don't understand then. Why do we have an energy crisis?
I think this is a failure, isn't just of this Labour government, it's actually of the Conservative governments before, which is we never say to people.
This is The Business of Politics with me, Harry Stebbings. This is the bi-weekly show where we sit down with the world's biggest political figures to discuss solutions to humanity's greatest problems. Now, joining us in the hot seat for our first episode, we have one of the UK's most experienced cabinet members. The man has held more positions than anyone else in several decades. Grant Shapps. Grant held 5 cabinet positions: defence, energy and transport, from navigating national crises to shaping Britain's economic and security policies. He's been at the heart of government decision-making for over a decade. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world if you followed Business of Politics on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us massively in sharing these conversations with more people. And I'd love to have you along for the ride. New episodes drop every 2 weeks, so hit follow and stay tuned. Grant, I'm so excited for this, dude. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure. Great to be here. Good to see you.
Now, I would love to start. You've had more roles in terms of cabinet ministerial positions than anyone since...
Since Jim Callaghan, who, depending on your age, you may not even know, but he was a prime minister back in the 70s. And it turns out that I've been through more roles than anyone since him, although some of them I've been in for a long time, and then some of them for the shortest time, including Home Secretary, famously
for 6 days.
The shortest time since it was established as a role in, I think, 1770 something.
I read this, but I thought in the 6 days you didn't make a single mistake.
Unblemished, yeah. Right? The only Home Secretary in history since...
perfect track record.
Since George III came up with the role.
So when that happened, were you like, I didn't do anything wrong?
So there you go. That's blameless, right?
Listen, the most recent was obviously kind of Defence Secretary. I do want to start. I think 2.2% of UK GDP is current defence spending. Is that a sufficient level, do we think?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, what should it be?
So for a start, we need to raise it to 2.5%, which is how I had left things. I frankly fought a bit of a battle with the Prime Minister then, Rishi Sunak, and with the Chancellor, and eventually got them to agree that we should uplift the spending. And I forget the exact figure, but it was like tens of billions of pounds more by the end of the century just to get to 2.5%. Because the spending is large, it's already about 56 billion. This is a big budget. Small percentage increases do make a big difference. But is that big enough? No. We need to be getting back up to more like it looked during the Cold War. And I'm not saying this because I'm some warmonger. I'm saying it because if you want to save yourself money in the long run, then you need to spend it now so that those who are against you, your adversaries, are not going to attack you. And that is what we need to achieve.
Can I ask, how do you think about the circular economy of investing in defence when you think about, bluntly, building defence companies in the UK, what that does for employment in the UK? When you invest more in defence, do you see positive reinforcements in the economy?
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the US economy that has done the cutting edge stuff, right? You know, inventing GPS, for example, which I imagine life without. And that came through military development. That was the purpose of it. I mean, same with so many of these things that have become usual in our lives. So, you know, how can you argue that you don't end up getting the benefits back? And I don't just mean your country's less likely to get invaded as Ukraine's been. I mean, also benefits that you and I would have every single day walking around the streets because we can navigate in that particular example.
So when we look at 2.2 to 2.5, as you said, it feels like not very much, but it's billions and billions.
Yeah.
Totally understand that. Is it realistic to expect that jump?
Yeah. I mean, look, if we don't do this, I think we're going to pay a lot more. anyway. So people say, well, what about the health and education, all the other budgets? Completely agree. But if you don't have your fundamental freedoms, which we seem to now almost lazily think are baked in, then none of those things will matter. How do I know? Look what's happened in Ukraine. They've been invaded, and I can tell you the education budget and the health budget and the rest of it are suffering. I mean, really suffering in a way that we can't imagine. And that's what happens if you let your defences down. And we are letting our defences down and allowing dictators to think they can take advantage of a Western way of life, which means freedom and liberty and, frankly, the opportunity to boot out the rulers if you don't like them anymore. And believe me, I know what that feels like.
Do you think we have the freedom that the general public thinks we have?
Yes, I think actually we probably, I'm going to go the other side of that, have more freedom than people generally think we have. So I think when you haven't seen the inside workings of government, it's tempting to feel that, oh, they've got a plan, they've got it all sewn up, they're making us do this. No. The inside of Whitehall is 99% cock up over conspiracy. There is far less control than people think. And actually, we're the lucky ones. We live in a liberal Western democracy where if I don't like the government, by the way, I really don't like what this government is doing. I don't like what they're doing to the economy. They're trashing people. If they're successful, they're making it harder to employ people, etc. They're giving away the shake or silence. Unforgivable. I don't like what they do. And I can say this on your podcast and be guaranteed not to be locked up for saying it. That is a privilege that we have and so many other people in the world don't have, and it's worth fighting for.
We both now have exposure to many great American entrepreneurs and businesses. A lot of our American friends say that the UK does not have freedom of speech, and that the minute that you say something against the government on social media, you are hauled in for it.
Well, I think there have definitely been some incidents where, that ludicrous thing where a Telegraph journalist tweeted something and was arrested. I mean, for goodness sake. And I do think at the edges, you have to watch for, it's an almost pernicious thing where freedoms can get whittled away. But to then describe us as not being pretty bloody free, I think is wrong. And unlike, and just to hit our American cousins back a little bit here, unlike in America, you do not have to be super wealthy to be part of running this country or indeed be the prime minister. Right now in the US system, it's impossible to enter it unless you're able to fundraise at the multi-million-dollar level. And in a sense, that isn't freedom in the same way that we recognize it here.
Going back to the defense and defense spending, so we appreciate that it's billions and billions of dollars. We appreciate we need to maintain our freedoms. How do we realistically do that? Where do we take it from?
Well, the first place I was going to start was to say we have a civil service which has grown bigger after COVID, during COVID. My route to paying for it was largely by taking the civil service back to, guess what, the size it was just before COVID. This is not some draconian cut. And I think that actually AI and other technological developments and actually faster, better ways of doing things could enable us to go further still. But even taking the civil service back to where it was and a couple of other changes basically would pay for the 2.5%. And I have to say, I think it is outrageous to have a civil service machine which has grown, possibly for good reason during COVID, and has never shrunk again.
Why did it?
Look, the state was involved in doing stuff during COVID that it's never had to do before. I was transport secretary during that period. I was transport secretary for a good long time. And COVID hit, and I literally in a couple of days it occurred to us that if we didn't have the state take over the entirety of the railways, not something that's natural for a Conservative to do. I'm probably guilty of more nationalisation in that moment than any Tory since well before Thatcher, and it's not something I want to do. But if we didn't do this, then the entire system would literally collapse within about 72 hours. So what do you need to do those things? You need a lot of organisation. You have to have a lot of people to sort it out, and the civil service grows. And I suppose it grew through the furlough program, responsible for, I think, rescuing 9 million people's jobs, and the programs that rescued all the businesses and what have you, all of which now we just take for granted and think just happened. Okay, that required more people, but it doesn't require more people today. And throughout government, and as I say, in the end, after transport, I was briefly in the Home Office and then Business Secretary and then Energy Secretary and then ultimately Defence Secretary. And in each of those departments and many others, there are too many people doing too little work, which means that you just expand the work. It's the old thing. Work just expands to the number of people or time that you allot it. And it's not efficient, and you wouldn't put up with it in business.
We're going to go through the different departments that you mentioned there. I do want to just stay on defence while we're here, because respectfully, we're both also involved in defence tech. Is our procurement process in the UK broken? And if so, what would you do to fix it?
Yes, it's broken, and not just in the UK. From a defence perspective, it's broken globally, certainly throughout the West. So what happens at the moment is there are a bunch of what are called primes, which seems to be specific to defence. I've never been in transport. They didn't talk about the primes. They just had large transport companies. So the primes in defence have the ability to really rule the market. And worse still, the government essentially operates in a sort of form of coalition with them. So it will go to very, very small number of companies. It will place orders. And in fact, in defence, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's an interesting perspective, it's the only place in government where you don't have to go out to tender. You can say, the only people I am aware of who make the Storm Shadow missile is a company called MBDA. MBDA, how much do you want for these missiles? And we will then place the order. So, that's extremely unusual. And there are very good reasons in defence. There are very few people who can make nuclear submarines or the engines for the nuclear works for them, Rolls-Royce, BAE, Babcock. But
is that why in the US they have cost plus?
Well, cost plus has applied here as well. And it's a terrible system. And it leads to things like the F-35 being the most expensive aircraft ever produced, because cost plus, to explain to your listeners and watchers, literally means, tell me, how much will it be for one of these? Okay.
£20.
You can have £20 plus your profit of £2. That's what I'll pay you. And then when the costs go up, you just come back to me and say, well, look, actually, we couldn't produce it for 20 quid. Can you just pay me 25 plus the £2? Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. That's cost plus. And no businesses would work like that ordinarily. So I think there's massive opportunity to shake this up. I tried to start doing it when I was Defence Secretary with my then excellent procurement minister, who's now shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge. And it's an idea about procurement where you don't have to, as happens in defence, build everything so that it is exquisite in nature, so that it is perfect, and you won't release it to the battlefield until it absolutely has all the bells and whistles on it. Instead, you can get it to the point where it's going to do the job, and then you can spiral improve it over time. And I think that's a very good idea.
Okay, so it's kind of relaxing the perfected requirements of certain equipment. We had Torsten on from Helsing and Klaus, a large investor in defence, from Lakestar, and they said that we should actually have mandated budgets for non-prime spending. I think it was 20%. I might be butchering the number, so forgive me for that. But a certain number that should go to non-prime spending.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it as blunt. I've spoken to Klaus about this. Klaus Hommel we're talking about. I wouldn't do it quite so bluntly. I think the entire culture of defence and defence spending needs to change. I think it should be much more like a regular marketplace. So, if you are in regular business, you will say, I've got a really good idea for something that I think there's a market fit for. I'm now going to go and, produce this thing, and I will find buyers. And because there's a global market in defence equipment, you may well find the buyer. But virtually none of that happens in defence. So there's this peculiar thing that not only are there these weird ways of buying things, cost plus and these primes, but the market doesn't operate in the normal way of people coming up with new inventions. And so it's much less inventive in that sense. Although, as I say, there can be specific examples like agencies that just go out and invent, that do come up with some really cool stuff as well. But by and large, it works the wrong way around.
I totally get that. And as an investor, often the core problem that we face is, listen, we know that actually you're creating something cool and it's an inventive solution, but we also know that selling to governments is a pain, it's arduous, and it takes years and years and years.
And everyone loses through that. We lose our defence is less good. We lose the taxpayer ends up paying through the nose for things like if you buy a widget for defense. It will be many, many, many times more expensive than going to, B&Q and buying that widget. Is it many, many, many times better? No, it might be a little bit better, but the costs are, out of scale. So for all of these reasons, we end up essentially being screwed as taxpayers by not having as much defense bang for our budget as we should. 56 billion is a lot of money. We should be able to get more from it. And we have this marketplace which is a barrier to new entrants and therefore new technology and more innovative stuff.
Does regulation impact effectiveness on the battlefield? ESG, we need a 10-year warranty for a one-time use of a drone.
ESG, definitely. And I railed against it a lot as defense secretary because I think it's immoral. And I'll tell you why. People think ESG in business, it's got to be ESG, it's fantastic. Actually, when it comes to defense, I think it's being immorally deployed. Here's why. Because of ESG concerns, a lot of funds won't invest in defense. That literally means that the cost of defending ourselves, our legitimate way of life, our ability to speak out, our free elections is artificially higher than if you weren't in defense and you were in some other production line, some other sector. And surely that is immoral. How can it be right that the thing that we all say we're in favor of, freedom and democracy, is made more expensive by something that's called ESG? I find it extraordinary. I'm a little bit, for a moderate middle-of-the-road, centre-right politician, I'm quite Trumpian about this. I actually think that the concept has run its course and should be scrapped because we should feel proud about backing defence of Britain. And I'll tell you something else. It goes further than that. There are bank accounts you can't get because the major British banks don't want to bank defence companies. How outrageous is that? They should be shown up for this.
Why not?
Because they'll say it's against our ESG rules. And that it doesn't matter whether you're producing something which is purely defensive or could be used in aggression, presumably for our defense as well, since we're not planning to invade anyone. It doesn't matter. The banks will turn you down from having a bank account. And it is absolutely outrageous, and more outrageous, I have to say, than the thing that caught up in the news a year or so ago, which was to do with politically exposed people. Anyone like me who's been in politics or in public service knows it's quite hard to get banking facilities or access to finances because you are a politically exposed person for serving the nation, for doing public service. Now, Nigel Farage pointed this out. It did lead to a sort of rethink of it. And that's one thing. But even more outrageous is that in this country, if you build something to defend the nation and defend freedom and democracy and our way of life against dictators, then the banks, British banks and institutions may well refuse to bank you. And that is an issue that I think should be banned. I don't think they should have the ability. And it's ESG which is at the heart of that problem.
So would you replace ESG with something? Would you scrap it entirely? What would be the solution to that?
Look, I think things run their courses, right? Of course, it's good to be environmentally aware. We don't want this planet to be destroyed because we don't look after it, obviously. Of course, we want people to be socially aware because I don't think you need to have an ESG officer in every corner of every business do that. You certainly don't have to have regulations that say that you can't invest in perfectly legal activities like defending your own nation. And so I think it probably served a purpose. It doesn't anymore, particularly with regard to things like defence. I think the government should immediately make it illegal to refuse banking facilities to businesses that are involved in defending our nation.
You mentioned kind of a Trumpian element of your views there. Trump has bluntly said that NATO is not paying its fair share and that the US is sumping up far more than it should. How do you reflect on that?
So look, of course, there's a fundamental truth to all these things, and every president has said you've got to pay more. Trump is likely to get people to pay more attention to that than perhaps a nicey approach. Fundamentally, I love the transatlantic alliance. I'm an Atlanticist. I believe in this connection. But actually, why should a US taxpayer pay for European defence? And why don't we think that we need to pay for it? I mean, what is that about?
Because we know the US will.
Yeah, and in this sense,
It's the free rider problem.
and he's absolutely right in this sense, right? Of course we should pay for it. Now, Britain does better than most. We're the second biggest spender in NATO, so we spend most in NATO outside of the US themselves. So we do, to some extent, lead by example. 10 years ago, we said it needed to get to 2% of GDP at a NATO summit that happened to be held in Wales, and the majority of NATO countries have now done that. I made a speech this time last year at Lancaster House saying we've moved from post-war perhaps to a pre-war era where we need to be more alert and on it. Let's get to 2.5% collectively. And a lot of NATO countries have echoed that desire, if not actually convinced their treasuries to follow down that path. So I do think that the view is changing. I absolutely believe that Trump has a very good point, as has every previous US president, that why the heck should an American taxpayer be paying for our protection when, it's on, the war that's going on right now in Ukraine is on our continent. Wake up, guys. We should be paying for more of that defense of Ukraine, and we should pay it as well, because if we don't, Putin ain't going to stop there. He's going to carry on coming west.
How does the Trump administration change our approach to defence in the UK?
So I think in the UK, I hope that in pretty rapid term, the Keir Starmer government realises that it's made a mistake by delaying the increase in defence spending to get to the 2.5%, first of all. I have got that in place earlier last year. Labour win the election, they scrap it and go for a defence review, which is nothing more than a ploy to delay the defence spending. And I hear it's going to delay the trajectory by a couple of years. That is just Rachel Reeves in the Treasury, trying to put the brakes on defending us. So I hope they'll undo that. And I hope that actually the Trump pressure makes them do it faster. We should get back to the timetable that we were on, and then we need to go further.
I hate political discourse where it's like one side and you don't appreciate the other side. Her rationale for doing that delay is we just don't have the money.
It will protect the jobs in the civil service because they're union friends. Said that they would not support them if they downsized the civil service back to where it was before COVID. And because they are funded by their union friends, I'm afraid, folks, it's as simple as this. They took the decision that they would prioritise keeping a larger civil service rather than defending the nation.
Should we continue to support Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I think it's the most existentially important thing that we do, so much so that I'm spending a lot of my time setting up something called the International Advisory Council to Ukraine, the IAC, and the entire purpose of the organization that I'm establishing is to ensure that we don't forget how important it is that a dictator can't take over a democracy and we all turn our backs.
Are we supporting them enough?
No, I think we can always do more. For example, there should be a very clear path by now for Ukraine joining NATO. I don't accept that we have been dragging our heels collectively as the West on this. Why shouldn't they? If that's what they want to do, why should they not join the Western Alliance? And we should just get out there and say it.
Would Putin have invaded Ukraine if Ukraine were in NATO?
No, not a chance.
Why?
Because Putin fundamentally is scared of NATO. He is way outgunned, outshipped, out-aircrafted, and even in personnel by NATO collectively. Many, many times over. As Defense Secretary, I used to go through the numbers. X times more ships, X times more people, X times more planes. And not only is he outgunned by NATO, he's also, they're massively more professional. When you see our people operate, it's impressive beyond belief. And for all of our moaning about our situation, our equipment and what have you, we don't have those dodgy Chinese tires on tanks that, get stuck in the mud and fall apart. So our equipment is better as well. And I think what his invasion of Ukraine did is to show us how actually weak the Red Army is by comparison to the way that we had imagined it would be. And the only reason he's still in the war 3 years later is he uses his men, and now increasingly men from other countries as well, in his meat grinder to die at a pace of 1,000 to 1,500 a day, killed or wounded Russians.
How much longer can he afford to keep doing that?
It's an interesting question because I think a lot of people have been surprised that he's managed to keep his economy going this long and have high inflation, etc. Very interestingly, he's pulled off some economic sort of black magic almost by, for example, forcing his banks to lend at certain rates to defense companies. In fact, interestingly, the exact extreme opposite of the thing we were just talking about, where our banks won't even open a bank account if you happen to think that you might produce a product that might help save our nation because of ESG, whereas he's actually done this thing. And that there's a very good article in the FT the other week about it. This has helped to sustain his war effort for a long time. But I don't think he'd be able to sustain it forever. And I think in the next year, 18 months, he would run into real problems. And every war is eventually lost, virtually every war, by the side that decides that it can no longer economically, financially afford to continue fighting.
What is the likely outcome?
I think in the end, and this may come about for a variety of different reasons, there will be a settlement. And I think that there will be some sort of deal in which Putin is told to go away with his tail between his legs, but he's able to dress it up as a great success to his own people. I think that's where it will end. Now, what would that look like? I don't know. He's been in Donbass and the east of Ukraine for 11 years now, since 2014. Perhaps what happens is there's a negotiation that the Ukrainians can live with, that he keeps some of the land he invaded there. I don't think that's right, but I do think in the end it's for the Ukrainians, not for the rest of us to dictate. But what I do think is the quid pro quo has to be the route to, and a rapid route, to NATO membership for Ukraine. And that is the thing which will stop Putin giving it a go again. And if we don't do that, then we're in danger of it just being a pause in the war, as it was, for example, after he invaded Crimea, and there's a pause, and then he carried on invading the rest of Ukraine 8 years later.
So we fast-track NATO membership for Ukraine. Do we see effectiveness of dollars going to Ukraine? There is often a concern from the general public of quite how much goes there, how much is in side pockets, and how much is actually effectively deployed.
Unfortunately, just to be completely blunt about it, Ukraine has a Soviet-era problem of corruption. And one of the things that President Zelensky and Umerov, who's the defense secretary, have asked to be done, and this is one of the purposes of the International Advisory Council to Ukraine, is to help with the fight against corruption internally. Now, having said that, the UK, for example, just does stuff very directly. A lot of our defence spending will be provided through things like storm shadows. I mean, that's fairly easy to understand. We provide them. They're not being diverted into somebody else's pockets. They are fired rightly on targets like sinking Russia's Black Sea fleet, for example, in the Black Sea around Crimea. So I don't think I think from the British contribution side, I think we can be reasonably reassured. I think there is a wider problem for Ukraine's eventual assimilation, I hope, into the West. And I think that, not that it's our business, we're not in the EU, but if they want to join, they should be able to. I'm more interested in their being able to join NATO. And I think we shouldn't be neutral on that. And I think we should be clearer that their route should be in NATO.
Final one before we move to one of the other, different ministerial positions is just the rebuild process. It is a very long process to rebuild a nation. I think Keir Starmer signed up to a 100-year rebuild project, and there was this intense uproar about it. How do we feel about an effective solution to rebuilding Ukraine?
First of all, I was very pleased he signed up to it, because it was actually my program. I invented the 100-year partnership whilst I was defense secretary, and Rishi agreed, and he launched it. He and I launched it, and so I'm very pleased that it's survived the transition in our own government. And congratulate Keir for finally, after more than 6 months, getting to.
I mean
Kyiv.
this respectfully. Is 100-year a marketing gimmick?
Yeah, no, I think it's an indication of we should bluntly capitalize on the fact that when you go to Ukraine, there is a real sense that when the chips were down, it was the UK that came to their defense. We did that by providing anti-tank missiles, the NLAWs, in advance of the war by training now tens of thousands of Ukrainians, by sending tanks when no one else would send main battle tanks, by sending missiles and permissioning them when no one else would do that, and much else. So when you go to Ukraine, I mean, most of your listeners probably won't have done, but when you do, you literally go to, Boris Square, and on the streets there'll be stands selling, like you do see tourist things, but the flags will be a Ukrainian flag merged into the Union Jack, just being sold on the streets, right? Because that is the view. And my thinking behind the 100-year partnership was we've now done so much with each other that we should make sure that when it does come to the rebuild and the integration, we should be at the heart of that. That's the 100-year partnership. And that's before you get to the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are now in the UK, including 3 who came and lived with my family for a year, which means that we have a big Ukrainian diaspora and a great reason to connect. And look, neither of us are in the EU. We're on the west of Europe. They're on the east of Europe. Let's join up and do great things. And there are now hundreds of schools, for example, and I think about 100 universities, which are doing things in each other's countries. They're teaching English as their second language in Ukraine. We have great opportunities to develop business and cultural links.
There is a huge sentiment that we have old people who are freezing in their homes, and the life and living quality in the UK is going down drastically, and we are funding weapons for Ukraine. Is that a short-sighted and glib view of the world?
Well, look, unfortunately, as I know in public affairs, it's often just not an either or. Is it possible to only provide education and not provide healthcare, or only provide housing but not provide defence? These are not straightforward yes-no questions. What we do know, and surely, with our history, we're sat in London, right, an area that was bombed during 2 wars, and in my own parents' lifetimes, right? So I think if you don't recognise that spending for our defence is value for money, then you basically are making a conscious decision that it's okay to be overrun. And if you are, okay, I know we're a little bit away from Ukraine, but if you're Poland, you get that. If you're Estonia, you get that, And actually, a dictator like Putin, if he was successful, if he'd rolled over Kyiv in 72 hours, which was his plan, and thanks to a lot of things, including a huge amount of British intelligence, he didn't. If he was able to do that, do you think he would have stopped there? No, of course he wouldn't have done. He would have been pushing at the borders, thinking NATO's weak as well. And, I just think it is always worth standing up for your rights and democracy.
I could talk to you all day about defence alone. I do want to touch on another element, which is you mentioned being business secretary. We obviously both operate in the business sphere today. I just want to start with, what do you think are the biggest issues the UK economy faces today?
Lack of productivity, overly taxed, lack of entrepreneurial understanding, and a cabinet stuffed full of absolutely nobody who's been in business at all. I think, just to be completely correct, that the Scottish secretary may have done something business. No one else has had private sector business creation experience, and it shows. If you want to know why they think they can tax businesses 25 billion national insurance, the answer is they think business will just pay up and it has no consequences. They forget it will leave unemployment higher. And, I said before the election, every Labour government in history has left more people on the dole, unemployed, than when they came into power. Every single one. And here we go again. They whack up these national insurance to employers, and employers go, actually, maybe we don't. And it doesn't stop there. They're sending people, the wealth creators, out the country, and thousands and thousands of people who create the jobs and wealth.
10,500 millionaires, and then 1 millionaire every 45 minutes.
I mean, and people might listen and look, I'm not a millionaire, it doesn't matter to me. It does matter to everybody, because if we do not produce the entrepreneurial businesses that create an economy that grows, then we end up shrinking. And we haven't seen the last of it. Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, thinks it will be a smart idea to introduce what they call day one rights. And because it has the word rights in it, it sounds like it might be good. What does this mean? It means we adopt a French-style employment market. And we know what happens in France. They have systemically higher unemployment than the UK. It can't be said enough. Usually up to twice as much, sometimes a third more, sometimes 2/3 more, but always higher than the UK. So this government has looked at, across the Atlantic at the US system, where they have this tear-away economy growing much faster than the rest of the world in the G7. And they've looked at Europe and France in particular, and which of the two models did they think it was a good idea to adopt? The French sleepy model. And it is insane. And we haven't even been hit with this yet, but the economy is about to be hit with that as well. So growth is zero. They don't understand business. They are sending people out the country who should be creating the wealth and putting off people going into business. It is a route to rags, not riches.
Again, I always want to try and have a balanced conversation. What is the pro case for day one rights? And for everyone listening, day one rights is...
So day one rights, so at the moment in the UK, after 2 years of working in a company, you get full employment rights, which means that you can't be dismissed without very, very formal processes. And in fact, you can't during the 2 years either in reality. But what it means is that businesses have to think once, twice, three times before they employ someone. And what happens in France, for example, is companies just go, on balance, because we've got this venture, we don't know if it will work, but under French employment law, if you employ that person, you can't get rid of them afterwards. And if you can't get rid of them, maybe best not to employ them. Or let's build that enterprise somewhere else. And so to adopt that makes it harder to get rid of someone, but guess what? People don't employ them either. You literally guarantee higher unemployment. And that, I'm afraid, is the stupidity of this ideologically driven government that believes that doing things like whacking up business taxes with national insurance, a tax on jobs, and day one employment rights is somehow a good idea, when in fact it's a really, really bad idea. And the people that will hurt most are the people at the bottom of the pile who find it harder to get re-employed when the companies just decide to stop employing people.
And my biggest worry also is this is combined at a time when AI is taking full effect at the same time.
Yeah, and it's kind of curious because you see Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, going out and saying, yeah, AI is really important, we're going to back it fully and what have you. I think he kind of intuitively believes that stuff, but doesn't seem to be prepared to take the steps. In fact, quite the opposite, is taking steps entirely in the other direction, which are going to make it harder to use AI to do the things that need to be done. Going back to my example of bringing the civil service back to the size that it was before COVID. Why don't we do that through using technology like AI? It would do a very good job of it. And I'm not talking about slashing the civil service in half, folks. I'm talking about just taking it back to where it was in 2020.
And so when we say about kind of first day rights, national insurance, what should we do then?
First of all, I think we need to look around the world and see which models work and which don't. All right, so I think international study is the first thing. We know that successful economies need successful people to lead the economy, and so much of a modern country's economy is to do with the brains that power the economy, right? That's the world we live in. Sort of, people call it thought leadership and all this kind of stuff, but basically really bright people who are prepared to go for it, take risks, set up businesses, etc. So we've got to be very clear that we want them to come to Britain, not be leaving Britain. So I would reverse a bunch of the things they've done. Capital gains tax, I think, increasing that sends a signal that we don't really want you to succeed too much in this country. Putting up national insurance.
By the way, on cap gains tax, what people forget is also there's a time delay in terms of the cash that comes in.
Yeah.
Because cap gains is by nature delayed.
Yeah.
I mean, for venture capital, for example, 10 to 15 years.
Right.
So I'm going to give you money in 10 to 15 years. It doesn't really help your budget.
Which is how you can tell that it's Rachel Reeves has done this through ideology rather than anything else, because it doesn't actually really make that much difference in the short run. And so it's really crazy that they would do things like that, which are self-harming. Rather than do this employment rights thing, I would actually make it the case that at the moment we have an employment system where if you employ someone and then they just turn out not to be the right fit, there's a lie in our employment system. You have two things that you do in that situation. You either have to say to lose that person, you either have to say, we're going to make that person redundant and demonstrate that job no longer exists. Well, that may not be the case. That person just may not be the right fit for the job. Or you have to fire them, which is a pretty evil thing to do. Why should you be firing someone? So, look, I'm sorry, your work wasn't up to standard, so I'm going to fire you, which also may not be the truth. There is another truth, isn't there? Obviously, clearly, that the job's not being made, the role's not being made redundant, and the employee shouldn't be fired. They're not bad like that. So why isn't there an option where you can say to somebody, look, this isn't working out, and we're going to try training and other things, but eventually it isn't working out. Here is instead maybe it's an enhanced redundancy or something along those lines. But no, the system says that's not a thing. So the system lies about the reality of what it is to employ somebody in the first place. And I remember under the Cameron government, I think it was Lord Young pointed this out. Hell broke loose, like he was kind of denying the truths of civilization. It is patently, obviously true that sometimes somebody won't work out for a job. So first of all, let's have an employment system that actually works for the employee as well as the employer by being honest about the system. Let's make sure that rather than, and again, I would use the size of the state and the taxes that are put on businesses and people as the example here. Let's get the state down to a size where it's doing the things that need to be done, isn't doing the optional extra stuff, and instead we give that money back to people and then they can use it to do the option extra stuff, right? So you could then reverse the extra tax, national insurance on businesses employing people. But I would go a lot further. I mean, I think with the way that we're running this country, and I say this now from experience in more government departments than anyone for many decades, and leading those departments is wrong. We take the view that it's okay and good, in fact, to have a civilian like me become a defense secretary or a business secretary or a transport secretary or home secretary or whatever. That's fine. But I think we then go too far because we also say, and we're going to have generalists run each of those departments. Now, I think you can have one or the other. And I think, assuming we're going to carry on having the democracy of the secretaries of state who are generalists, they're politicians, they're elected, there's a democracy to that.
Do you think that is right? I mean this respectfully.
Well,
I've always found it kind of challenging.
You could do the American system, and the American system is my opposite number in defense was a guy called Lloyd Austin. He certainly knew nothing about politics per se, but he had been an Army 4-star general. So you can say he would be a better defense secretary. And then you could say, well, where's the democracy in that? Well, how do you... So I understand there needs to be a balance. But what I don't think works at the moment, and this is really... I've thought about this a lot in the last 7 months since leaving office, is both the Secretary of State, so me in these cases, but then the principal secretary, the permanent secretary rather, who's the person running the civil servant who runs the department. Both of you are generalists. So I think actually we probably need to think about, should we appoint, assuming we're going to carry on with our system of having, elected politicians lead, I think there's a democratic reason to do that. Should we then have the winning party capable of the government, capable of appointing the leadership of each of the departments, right? So my energy, just take a random example, I was energy secretary. Should the permanent secretary, the leader of the civil service in the energy department, should that person perhaps be somebody who is an expert in energy from the energy sector? The world's best person could run the department. And then you'd have a better mix. And I think maybe if we're really going to think about taking this country forward, we do need to look at the way that the civil service is structured currently as well.
If we go back to just in terms of improving economy, we think about bringing the best talent to this country, we think about cap gains, probably not worth increasing. Anything else where we're like, that would increase the productivity, the economy more broadly?
Yeah. So look, I think actually we need to probably face this the other way around, which is at the moment we sort of bumble along. We're here today, we'll do this thing in the budget, we'll see where it gets to. There's never really a plan. I think this is a failure, just to make the point clear though, isn't just of this Labour government, it's actually of the Conservative governments before, which is we never say to people, here is our plan for the country. We are of the view that we can be, to give you an example, the biggest economy in Europe, and we think we can do that by, let's say, the middle of the century or whenever we think it's viable. And that is our grand, overview plan. The way that we're going to get there, working back from that objective, is we need to do these things in line. Now, rather than randomly increasing or decreasing national insurance or whatever we're doing to the education system or whatever we're actually working to an overall objective. And I think I became aware of this when I was a minister under the Cameron government, particularly when I spent a lot of time in what were called the 8:30 and 4 o'clock meetings. So there were 2 meetings per day in the Prime Minister's study. And this is not a criticism of Cameron. It's the same for all the other. I served 4 prime ministers, same with all of them, is that you end up on the day-to-day, what's coming in today, what's the news agenda, how am I going to respond? And you never think about the full long-term future of the country. You say you do, but if you're not setting out a plan, you don't. And so to answer the question of what other things would I change? What taxes? What entrepreneurial reliefs? What ways to deregulate? I'd start with what's the objective first, and therefore, scientifically speaking, what would you have to do to make those things what would have to be true to make that thing happen? Unless we get into thinking like that, we will never make progress as a country. We will bumble along. And I'm afraid we are in the bumbling along category right now, which is an absolute crying shame, because the United Kingdom can and should be better than the sum of its 4 parts. And that's what I think we should be doing.
Do you think it's going to get better before it gets worse? Sorry, worse before it gets better.
I was going to say, surely the other way. I'm afraid, yes. I mean, it is just literally inevitable. Employment is being gummed up, as we've discussed in detail. We're not spending enough on our own defence. Taxes are out of control. We haven't been straightforward enough with the public, which is to say, look, we did have to spend a hell of a lot of money on, both COVID and the Ukraine war, probably £500 billion. I'm sorry, folks, it is going to cost you more. But again, here's our plan to reduce the taxes, which we're not even bothering to engage in that. And this government doesn't even want to. They seem to think higher taxes are good for the sake of goodness knows what, satisfying their backbenchers. So all in all, I'm afraid, folks, it probably will get a bit worse, or maybe a lot worse. First, we guarantee we'll have higher unemployment when this government leaves office, for example. But I don't think that means the game's up. We still have, like 3 or 4 of the best universities in the world in the UK, right? We still have the English language. We have the time zone. We have phenomenal entrepreneurialism, and we're very good at it. It's just, unfortunately, a lot of the time we can't keep it in the country because we can't fund it. Although, thanks to people like you, we're doing a better job on some of that as well.
Do you think career politicians is an incredibly dangerous structure to have?
Interesting. I think there is a dangerous move in this country where we've gone from, it was very much a part-time pursuit. I mean, in literally the 1800s.
You were farmers and politicians.
Right, or you were a banker and a politician, or you were a lawyer and a politician. And I think that was too much the other way, right? Running a country is a full-time, serious thing to do. But not everybody in Parliament is running the country. Most of them are holding the government ministers to account. So I think, with the exception of where you are a government minister and therefore you have a second job other than being an MP, everybody else should feel freer and be given the opportunity to go and learn more about the world, including what it's like to work. And unfortunately, we've now banned that to the point where it's become somehow terrible to experience the outside world. And God forbid you should do that and earn any money doing it. And this is insanity. It is leading to, as you described, the professional class of politicians who know absolutely everything about nothing. And that is dangerous.
So you think we should encourage external employment for MPs?
It just explain this to me. It is perfectly acceptable, and I don't think a constituent ever said to me otherwise, to be both the Member of Parliament, as I was for Welwyn Hatfield for 19 years, and combine that with being any number of ministers and secretaries of state. So I could be Defence Secretary, and I can tell you, I have never lived, eaten, thought, drink, slept an issue more than when you've got kind of, literally the nuclear secrets of the country on your shoulders, right? The first letter you sign is to become a nuclear deputy. I can't even go into what that means.
Did you feel the weight of that?
So absolutely. You cannot and should not do that job without doing it. But no one ever came to me and said, you can no longer be my MP because you've got this second job. And the second job is defending the nation. And quite rightly, it is perfectly possible to do both. And I hope I was still a bloody good MP, had my constituency office organised, able to serve my constituents and what have you. So I think that's fair enough. But for some reason, if you're a backbencher and you don't have this second government role, it is absolutely now, and this, Keir Starmer has gone even further on this than anyone else, but again, we weren't blameless in it. It is absolutely looked down upon should you do anything else at all. And Why? I mean, why is that the case? If you in your own time choose to do things, why is that bad?
Do you not just think it's easier because otherwise it's too difficult to segment time and then like bluntly show that you are doing your job as an MP if you are also an investment banker? So then you'd have people say, we shouldn't pay MPs because you're an investment banker.
I think it would be advantageous. I don't think we should have everyone's investment bankers in the same way as I don't think we should have too many more barristers in the house. But what is wrong with people learning about what it's like for the people that they represent to be in business, to run a corner shop, to build a business, to be in a profession? And wouldn't you then be much better positioned to talk about it? And sure, have full decorations or whatever, fine. But why is it a bad thing to have that experience? And this is, I'm afraid, this is just where we've ended up getting in. And the further we get into this, you get into the smaller and smaller, more myopic view of the world, to the point where you actually put off good people, the really best people, from going into public life. And here's the thing. I'm embarrassed to tell you, this is an argument I would have found difficult to make as a member of parliament.
Because you'd be scared of the pushback.
Because there'd be a huge scandalous story that I thought that it'd be a good idea for MPs to have outside experience. I actually think it's a thoroughly good idea, and we should encourage it. Now, I don't think it's possible to do too much of that and be a minister, and certainly not a Secretary of State.
After so many, do you kind of go, wonder what I've got now?
I think I've been unbelievably fortunate and lucky. And there is a basic deal that, like it or not, it exists, which is if you decide to go into public life in this country, you forego your essentially right to earn a crust, earn a living, in return for enormous power to run the country. And by definition of having gone through and been Secretary of State in so many different roles, run so many different parts of government, I have been able to experience a lot of different parts of government. It's one of the things, though, with the benefit of now 7 months of hindsight, time to actually stop and think about these things, that has made me think more radically now than I did whilst I was in post. So those comments I was making about not just the size of the civil service, and by the way, there are many brilliant civil servants, this is not a rant against them, but also the fact that we can't put in people who are the world's best people to run that department because that's just not the system. Things like that. Things about what I think about regulation, deregulation, taxes, things about the way that I think that we need to set an overall objective for the nation and not just bumble along, what is our overall... Those things are much, much clearer to me, both through having had the enormous range of different jobs, but also through time to stop and think about it.
The final one I do just want to touch on is your time as energy minister. What are the biggest challenges we face today as a nation when it comes to energy? It's often that we have the highest energy price, I believe, in Europe. You may correct me. What are the biggest challenges we face?
It's one of the higher. It's not the highest in counterfact. But biggest challenges are we're going to need a lot more energy. And we see it through data centers. We see it through training LLMs and all the rest of it. Although I don't think it's quite as people imagine as it happens. I think the reason we're going to need more is because it's going to come down in price. So it sounds odd that we will need more, but because it comes down in price, we'll use it more and therefore need more. So I think the reason why we'll need more is not quite the one that people pinpoint, but nonetheless, yes, we'll need more power. In the end, this will be resolved. So if I had an open-ended, bet, a short on a market, it would be energy. But this is in an undisclosed and lengthy period of time. And I'll tell you why I say this. Because eventually fusion will work. And it's already been, it already exists. It will work. I was with a former Rolls-Royce chief scientist this morning talking about this actual subject over breakfast. Or eventually we'll get unlimited amounts of power, essentially, because microchips, which at the moment take so much power that in your phone you need to have a whole big battery and whatever, will just use a photo light cell and be able to operate on 1,000th of the power that they operate on today. All of these are technologies which are right now in development, all of these things. So I think we'll actually solve the problem of humans generating sufficient power. There's more than enough power out there. The sun provides it. And so my long-term bet would be to short the entire energy market. However, good news, folks. If you're in energy, this is still decades away, and it's undisclosed and difficult to know how long away. And in the meantime, we need to make sure that the security of our supply is good. We just got to get on with stuff that our system isn't capable of delivering fast enough. I set up Great British Energy. The purpose of it was to deliver quickly small modular reactors, SMRs. And these are small-scale, modular-built reactors which actually produce still quite a lot of power, or a huge amount of power, more than original nuclear power stations. And I wanted to get the competition over and done with within a year. And then the machinery of government kicks in. And here we are 3 years later, and they're still only part the way through the thing. And so, again, we need to redesign, re-engineer the system to actually deliver the stuff that we need done fast. And because I've had so much experience on the inside and time to reflect on it, and now see exactly what needs to be done.
What would you advise Germany in particular, who are going through an energy crisis, haven't invested in nuclear for years and years? What would you advise them, given your experience?
Yeah, I mean, switching off switch back on your nuclear power stations for one thing. I mean, it is insane. They've decommissioned perfectly operable, with many years left in them, nuclear power stations. Because the Greens have sort of rampaged through their coalition government essentially, and that is causing them huge pain. It was fine when they were buying in cheap, gas and oil from Putin, and now they can't do that. That's caused them enormous pain, and frankly, it's a drag on the whole of the European economy. So first of all, do the sensible things, and then a small hidden British success story that most people won't realise, most of your listeners, watchers won't have heard, is that Britain actually leads Europe when it comes to renewable energy production, and Germany needs to catch up with the UK. I mean, if I was advising them, we have, for example, not just the world's biggest offshore wind farm, but the second biggest, the third biggest, the fourth biggest, and the fifth biggest in the world are all off our coast. We have been investing in this stuff quietly. And here's an amazing stat I loved when I was Energy Secretary. We were producing as much solar power in the UK as France, despite the fact that France is twice as big geographically and clearly has better weather than us. So actually, we're quite good at some of this stuff.
I don't understand then. Why do we have an energy crisis if we've got the first to fifth wind farms, solar we're crushing?
Yeah, well, I mean, also, by the way, we closed down coal when no one else has. Last year was the last year we produced any coal into our energy mix.
And that's a mistake?
No, I don't think it is, but it's one of the reasons. And no other developed nation has done that. And, by the way, if you want to look at the history of it, you may remember that Margaret Thatcher realised that coal mining probably wasn't the future of the nation. And so we ended up getting there faster, partly because of her, partly because of green policies. But I also think it's a completely mistaken, idiotic thing for Ed Miliband, for the Labour government to be doing, to deny us the ability to dig the oil and gas that we have in our own North Sea out. So they're denying these licenses right now. Rosebank is case in point. And instead, that forces us to go and buy the same oil and gas because we still need it for other cars and other things, heating homes and factories. Instead, we go and buy it from elsewhere, creating twice, 3, 4 times as much CO2 in the process. And again, it's just one of these ideological blocks that Labour have got themselves into, a bit like the employment law, that they can't get away from.
Why deny it?
They think that it's not green enough to dig it yourself, but they think it's fine to ship in all manner of oil, gas, LPG and other fossil fuels from elsewhere without limit. So we end up both having to import rather than have it for ourselves or even export, and increasing the CO2 attached to each ton that you, or however you measure it, kilowatt or kilo, well, it depends what the product is, whatever you're importing, and being completely self-defeating when it comes to jobs and all the rest of it. And it's one of these huge frustrations when you get into people sometimes say, why did you become a Conservative politician? Why not Labour? And the simple answer was, Labour too often get caught up in their ideological purity. I mean, they argue about it most of the time between themselves, which is why they usually fail to get elected. But also, Conservatives, on the other hand, are practical. They do what works. And I think at our best, we just recognise that as a fact. And rather than being absolutist about this oil and gas thing and then importing it instead, any logical conclusion would be, dig it out the North Sea. Not least because you can then fill the hole with captured carbon and that's another market for us. And you can sell the space there, capturing carbon to Europe and elsewhere. So there's actually good economics in digging it out as well.
Before we do a quick fight, you mentioned that the rational conservative. How do the Conservatives combat the rise of reform?
Well, I don't think it's sensible to attack reform voters or even their leadership. And we saw some of this when David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party. I think he would agree, unwisely attacked people who voted UKIP at the time. And of course, what does it do? If you voted UKIP or Reform, or you go, yeah, I'll show you what I'll do. I'm going to vote for them more, right? So I don't think it makes sense to attack Reform for the membership or their whatever, right? In the end, if we are going to run this country successfully, our true enemy is the Labour Party. I say enemy, I mean the people who, for all the reasons we've just discussed in the last 40 minutes, the people who are so ideological they don't know how to run an economy properly and are therefore going to cost people's jobs. If we're going to attack all of that, we have to reunite the right at some point. And so I think the way to, as you say, deal with Reform and Farage, what have you, is to go ahead and tell people what we will do, right? Stop attacking them. They're not the people who are destroying this country are Labour, right? So let's focus on the real target. By the way, there are hundreds and hundreds of Labour MPs. There are 5 Reform, right? There are even 70 Lib Dems. Look at where the real battleground is, and let's focus on that. And instead, work on winning back Reform voters who I think if they heard us say, I hope some of the stuff that I've been saying to you today about getting the economy back on track and getting people's jobs viable again and getting the government out of people's lives, would actually just come and support us.
Do you think Nigel Farage is a master marketeer or capitalising on an incredibly disgruntled population at the right time?
Well, I think he's very good at sort of picking the issue and what have you. But I mean this in all fairness, when you haven't seen the system and the cogs and the way that Whitehall operates and dealt on the geopolitical stage to see why it is that the UK finds it hard to do this, that and the other, it's very easy to come up with what sound like very simple solutions to extraordinarily complex global problems. And if you're good at presenting them as Nigel clearly is, you can make it all sound so simplistic. But actually, Brits understand the world's a bit more complicated, right? I don't think we are, in the nicest possible way to our American cousins. I don't think we're quite so reactionary. I think people do want these problems solved, but I don't think that anyone thinks it's simple, and they'll give you a bit of leeway and time to get it sorted out. But not if you head off in the wrong direction, like Keir Starmer's government has, where people lost patience within a couple of months, and 7 months in, it's probably over for him now. He probably can't recover. So I would say to people, like, you've seen what Labour have done and how they failed. You've heard that some people say, look, there's just some very simple solutions, but actually in your heart, the real solutions are a properly worked out program. Now, we haven't got that yet, but I hope that's where we can get to.
I'd love to do a quick fire. So I say a short statement. You give me your immediate thoughts. It's about 60 seconds or less. Should Keir Starmer get rid of Rachel Reeves?
Yes, I think she's been hugely damaging to the economy. In part by just talking it down and then by her actions next.
Is that possible? I studied actually, and 11 of the last 12 prime ministers who got rid of their chancellors were then bluntly ousted in the subsequent 12 months.
Yeah. Yes, it's possible, and I agree the risks are very high for him. But unfortunately, the risks for you and me, the economy, British people's higher if he doesn't act.
4 different leaders, Cameron, Johnson, Truss and Sunak. Who was the best? Who was the worst?
Sounds like a fudge, but Boris obviously tremendous fun to work for.
Was it?
He just come on, why don't we just And actually, it had phenomenal impacts. We rolled out vaccination to this country faster than any other advanced nation. I don't know why he doesn't get any credit for it, but that happened because of the way that he was, the way that he would not take no for an answer. Cameron, very organised. He felt like a leader, someone you'd follow. I think with Truss, I only served her for half an hour in her cabinet. I sat in the cabinet actually for half an hour at the very last cabinet before her government collapsed as Home Secretary. But I can't really speak to her as a leader in that sense. And Ricci, great on the detail, almost the exact opposite, but too far opposite to Boris. And I think the perfect leader would be somebody who had the inspiration of Boris, the ability to motivate, and the detail of Ricci and the ability to really understand a complex issue. And I think that would be the perfect, perhaps non-existent leader.
Which position was the hardest?
Defense Secretary. You just have decisions to make that one day maybe I'll be able to talk about, but where people's lives are in your hands in ways that they'll never know about, probably. And, you constantly on your shoulder that concern that a misstep could create a global problem of, epic proportions. And so the responsibility of that job alone meant that was the job which was the hardest.
Don't laugh for the lack of professional question, but I always watch Spooks with my family. I don't know if you know that TV show. And we're always like, does that happen in real life?
Well, I've been watching in real life the show, which is obviously not real life, Black Doves, and I can tell you it was massively inaccurate. I was going to tweet on it at one point because here was the defense secretary whilst people are being murdered in London, traveling around in a taxi. And I can tell you, I couldn't even leave my house when I was defense secretary. It's like it's like a state-sponsored house arrest. You have a protection team with you always when you leave the house. And so I don't know about the accuracy of Spooks, but I can tell you, Black Dove, I just got it wrong. And also, I'm thinking my wife is not a killer on the quiet, but I haven't discovered yet, whereas Keira Knightley clearly is.
What does everyone think they know about politicians that they just don't get?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing actually is people are very cynical about politics and politicians. On the inside of being a politician, I started off with the mindset, as you must, because you've come from not being a politician, of thinking what everyone else thinks and being quite cynical. Over the years, I actually became less and less cynical because it is true, and even true of this lot who I don't like in government, that people actually go into it for the right reasons. And when they're there, they spend their time and many, many, many hours of the day trying to do the right thing, even though they may be completely misguided, as this lot are, and doing terrible things. So actually, I've become less cynical over time. So the thing that most public don't know about politicians is they're less cynical than you think they are.
You can take one person from the Labour cabinet to your cabinet. Who do you take?
Oh, my goodness. And like most people in the UK, I'm probably struggling to name members of the cabinet. Now, are these people who are going to remain Labour or because they...
No, they will defect.
Oh, they'll defect. I'd take Wes Streeting then.
You take Wes Streeting.
Yeah.
You think the NHS is in good hands?
I actually also think he's in the wrong party.
Is there black hole bullshit?
Yeah, it was entirely... Look, the thing about this country is we have an independent... OBR, so the Office of Budget Responsibility, which literally publishes the numbers. So this idea that it is possible in 2024 last year to come into government and go, oh, I didn't know about that, is fundamentally untrue. And so for them to come in and make up a 22 billion black hole and include in it settling with the train drivers, ASLEF and what have you, levels of pay rise, which clearly the railway can't afford because the unions had sponsored, members of the cabinet into their roles, to settle at that and then say that's part of the 22 billion black hole, ditto the other things that they settled. If they want to spend like that, that's on them. That's their problem. Instead, what they did was somehow try to claim it was us. And again, a bit like I'm saying actually with some of the simplistic, responses given by, certain politicians, the world's not that simple and the public understands it. So the public didn't buy this 22 billion. And that is why they found it so difficult to sell their story.
Which moment as a minister did you go like, you know what, darling, when you come home from work, we're in pretty good shape?
I think that the funniest time I came home from work was nothing to do with that. So if I just do that, the old politician trick of saying you're asking the wrong question and answer a different one.
Go for it.
I came home from work one day and I had just had the privilege and honour of going to meet the Prince Charles before he was king. And I had a discussion with him and he was very interested in something we were doing. On the way out, after an hour and a half, we bumped into his son, and who was just about to get married. Sort of introduces me, So I said, "Do you know?" I said, "Well, yeah, and I think I recognise your son." And anyway, I get home, And I am overflowing with, you won't believe it. My wife, Belinda, the kids are there running around quite little at the time. You won't believe it. Today, I didn't just meet one future king of England. I met 2 future kings of England. Can you believe my day in the office? I mean, it just doesn't get more extraordinary like this. And my wife, Belinda, who's from Manchester, very blunt, Grant, that's absolutely great, but can you unload that dishwasher and get the kids to bed, please? And that, down to earth, like that.
That is amazing.
With a thump.
That is amazing.
With a thump.
Which parliamentary practices should be culled?
That's a very interesting question. So I like every MP.
You know, we have someone on the team who used to work in government.
Oh, really?
And he was like, this is the one.
Okay. Well, look, So every MP goes into Parliament thinking, God, this is just so old-fashioned. Why are we voting in person? I could text in a vote, etc. And then you work there and you realise actually there's a point to it, which is it forces MPs to get together for 10, 12 minutes. You are in the same voting lobbies. You get to on behalf of your constituents, find the housing minister. And you say, I've got my constituents got a problem. What are you going to do about it? And the minister will usually put, okay, no, okay, send me an email. You get stuff done for your constituents. So the answer that most people go for, and today I see actually there's some committee going on in the House about, or some process about how to modernise voting, by which they probably mean proxy voting or electronic voting. Don't do it, folks. It destroys your ability to help your constituents by being able to literally collar the minister who can fix that problem, probably in a way faster than anyone else. What would I change? Oh, it can be a bit stuffy at times. So probably they should put air conditioning in. Everyone would be a bit happier. I mean, the place is literally falling apart.
Penultimate one. Which foreign political figure do you most respect?
I think Minister Umerov and probably Zelensky. So Umerov won't be a household name, but he's the Ukrainian defense minister. And I would speak to him, how's your day? How's it going? And I would be dealing with, I don't know, some budgetary dispute with the Treasury or something. He'd be dealing with bombs falling on their capital, And I think so I think Umerov, and then by extension also Zelensky, who I know and like, and, that guy, and we're all forgetting about it, but he's 3 years into, you think about Churchill during the war and what he went through. Zelensky is now over halfway through what Churchill went through. And I think it's easy to forget, but, actually extraordinary brave leadership. Remember, the Americans were trying to get Zelensky, give him safe passage out of the country as Putin was invading. And he said no, and in his T-shirt, just like you, he's defending our Western values, right? So this is what I expect you to be doing next.
It's very kind of you.
Yeah.
I'm a venture capitalist. I mean, he's defending Western values.
No, don't undersell yourself.
Listen, I think final one. Everyone has a view of politicians and who you are. I wanted to give you the chance of who do you want people to think of when they hear Grant Shapps? What do you want people to think of you?
Well, I suppose having done so many jobs, it is experience would be the one obvious thing. I've seen things and been involved in things and at the critical stages of the nation's life, which have led me to see what we should be doing and now recognise with the benefit of some time what those things should be. So I hope people would think that I was at least wise and thoughtful. I don't know that, people really ever get to know what a politician is like, and that's because, unlike this great chat, most of the time on the Today programme, on Newsnight or something, you're cut off after 20 seconds, partway through a point, and you just don't get the opportunity for people to ever hear.
But okay, I tweeted actually last week that Keir Starmer will be the last Prime Minister who does not podcast or own their own channel of communication.
Yeah.
Tweet.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. You cannot fit it in a 20-second segment on Newsnight, but you can if it's your channel.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. I think that for all sorts of reasons, including AI, politics is going to look a lot different. What's it going to even look like to be an MP or to campaign in another 4 years' time? And so a lot of that. So I hope that somewhere it will be, this is an experienced guy who, like him or hate him, has done a lot of things and actually gets how it works. 1, 2, actually understands and gets technology, and business, both far from universal in Parliament and government, I'd say, and I think 3. I mean, look, I feel like I have more to do, and in what role, we'll see.
I cannot thank you enough for being so fantastic. You've put up with a huge array of different topics, so you've been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Great fun to do.
What an incredible episode that was with Grant. Now, if you enjoyed the show today, hit follow on your favourite podcast platform. In 2 weeks' time, we'll release our show with Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservative Party. We so appreciate your support and following, and this is going to be an incredible journey.